Hello there and welcome back to The Closet Historian and back to my sewing parlor for an archive sewing project. Well, sewing and pattern drafting. This was a Patreon project from a few years back. Surprising that I'm able to say that now. It seems like I just made this the other day, but technically I made it before I moved here, so it must have been a while ago. And now, in a vain attempt to stay sane over this New Year period, I'll let past me take it away. Today I'm going to be making a dress inspired by a couple of different things. First of all, this dress that I saw floating around over on Pinterest with its absolutely gargantuan sleeves, and then these split sleeves from this McQueen show from many years ago, and this show in general actually I was finding very inspirational, and this show does seem to be inspired heavily by Japanese aesthetics and traditional Japanese clothing, and so I decided to combine all these elements together for a new dress today. And this is another black dress, so hopefully you can forgive me, but who doesn't want a black dress where it looks like you might just be wearing a cape until you get close and realize it's the gigantic sleeves. Luckily, this isn't too difficult of a modification, so let's jump on over to the blue patterning table of doom and get started. And I begin with my basic bodice block as usual and my sketch here. There's also another sketch for a very fun jacket I hope I get to make soon, also on that same page, so ignore that for now. But I will of course take a tracing of my basic bodice block with the darts, the apex, all relevant information traced down, and sketching those darts so that I can move them around. I'm going to tip up the neckline like I've been doing so often usually. Again, come over from the neckline, 1/2 inch up, 1.5 inches, curve into the front neckline, curve down back into the shoulder seam. You've seen me do this neckline quite a lot now. I'm in love with this neckline. It's like having a stand collar without having to sew a stand collar. What a deal. And I will go ahead and tip my shoulder point up 1/4 inch as well, so I can put a thin little shoulder pad in here later. And I did initially add a 1/2 inch along the center front here, but I ended up cutting this out without a seam there, just on the fold, as per usual with the center front on the fold, that is, because in the end I decided against the center front seam. Now I'm going to move my waist dart into 2 additional side darts here, so I will have 3 darts on the side seam total, or from the side seam to the apex total. And I was just deciding on where I wanted those. Then I can of course cut everything out and slash and spread those darts. Cut up the dart leg from the waist, cut up the new dart legs, and just close that waist dart, tape that shut, and now I have the dart fullness moved into the side here, into 2 more side darts. I'm going to leave the other side dart that's on my block right where it is, and just distribute this other dart fullness into 2 more here along the side, just to keep the front of the dress as smooth as possible, because I will be doing a little bit of HTV vinyl on this dress today. I know we're shocked. At least I will be using a new color of HTV today. Instead of using the flock, I'm going to be using a metallic silver, which is very fun. Again, it's a material called soft metallic. It's the same material as the oil slick I used on the channel this last week, but it is just in the pure silver color, or the kind of chrome colorway. I'm just redrawing my dart legs here, because of course I don't want my darts, when I sew them, to go right to my apex. I need to come out 1 1/4 inches. That's just what I personally prefer on myself. So just redrawing my dart legs, then I can fold these closed, cut the excess off the side, and have the correct shape of extra paper and therefore eventually fabric along the side seam here. Go ahead and cut the rest of this out, like so, and then I can start working on the back, which will have even less for me to do for this dress today. Now I'm going to make those same neckline modifications you see me make quite often. Again, here on the back, I just traced the shoulder seam from the front, including that tip up at the shoulder for the bit of shoulder padding, and then I just had to tip the center back out 1/4 inch along the top third of the pattern or so, just to make sure that I have enough room for the curve of my back when doing a raised collar like this one. But you've seen these collar modifications, again, yeah, several times now in several other videos. I can try and link a video where I take it slower below as well, if you haven't seen me do that one before. Then I was just trying to figure out exactly where I wanted my HTV motifs today, so just trying to figure out the proportions and placement for those decals later. I will trace a copy of my basic block sleeve here, front and back. Sorry it's hard to see. We'll be making a lot of changes before you need to see it, so don't worry about it. Basically all I'm going to do here is just even out the sides. So these are at a bit of an angle, so my sleeve tapers a tiny bit, and there's obviously the elbow dart in the back. I'm just going to ignore that and go ahead and just straighten off the sides here, so I have a big cylindrical sleeve as opposed to anything fitted. Just straightening that off, straightening off the hem as well, like so. And then I will cut this out. This is about 1 inch longer than my sleeve normally is at this point, but I want this to be nice and long and floopy and ridiculous today, so you know. Basically, we're going to be showing you the largest possible flared sleeve. or at least how to do the largest possible flared sleeve, even if I personally didn't have enough fabric to do the full extent of it today. And in order to be able to spread this sleeve to its maximum flared potential, I will go ahead and draw lines every 2 inches across the body of the sleeve here, just parallel lines that I can cut up and spread for maximum flare. To do so, I will grab another large piece of paper, tape down the center here, and then I'm going to flare each side of this, so here's the front, all the way until it's at 90 degrees. So technically you would want to flare this 90 degrees for a full circle cut sleeve, basically, like a circle skirt, but with a very strangely shaped arm side at the top of it, as opposed to the waist. But actually, I'm going to go ahead and leave about, I don't know, 30 degrees, tape this down about 30 degrees out from the maximum spread here, just because I was afraid I wouldn't have enough fabric. And in the end, I did have to cut each sleeve out in 2 pieces because this would be a giant pattern piece. It is like cutting out a circle skirt. You would need a ton of fabric if you wanted to cut this all out in 1 piece for each sleeve, because this is gigantic. And later when I hemmed them, it felt like hemming 2 circle skirts for 1 project, which was a lot, honestly, especially since I was hemming by hand. No surprise there. But yes, you can just see how I've spread this out and added a bunch of flare into this sleeve, just truing that line here at the bottom, which is actually the sleeve cap, and spreading everything out so that there's a heck ton of fullness now in this sleeve. I'm sure we've added wedges of fullness to sleeves before to create flared sleeves, but this is a flared sleeve beyond any flare I've done before. This is definitely the most giant sleeve I've ever made, including the 1890 stuff, which is shocking. I just needed a little bit of extra paper down here, so I just taped that on after I trimmed the underarm seam of my sleeve here. I'm just going to go ahead and make sure that I have the hem even, measuring as I go along here. As I tape everything down, this required a lot of tape, as you can imagine. And I'll just round off that hem by eye. Of course, you could put more or less indications, depending on how confident you are in your curving ability. But I'll just round off my hem here. Again, this is basically a circle cut sleeve. So if you imagine a circle skirt, it's like that, only done with the sleeve pattern instead of with the skirt pattern. So just making sure this is the same length here. Again, smooth this off, cut this all out. You could, of course, leave this more pointed if you wanted a like handkerchief hem on this sleeve, just like the way you would with a circle skirt. Hopefully that makes any sense. I will tape down my floops here, and this is my giant sleeve pattern for today. Oh my goodness. So I'll just label this back of sleeve, front of sleeve, refined my center, giant sleeve, 2024. Now for this dress that I saw over on Pinterest, in all of its beige glory, they don't have a split down the center, but because I was looking at those Alexander McQueen dresses, and I often like a split down the center of my sleeve, I wanted to go ahead and add that in. So I'm again finding the center of my sleeve here, and I'm going to split this apart. And then I can technically close up the underarm seam and just have the opening here along the top. Unfortunately, I did not have enough fabric to cut that out this way, but I'll show you how it would be done. So if you wanted this to be one big piece, you can technically close this underarm seam like so. Just draw in my seam allowance that I know is along the side of my sleeve, layer that shut, tape that closed, and now instead of having the underarm seam, we have a like shoulder along the outside of the arm seam. Hopefully that makes sense. And naturally, since I closed up the seam allowance on the underarm seam, I need to add some out here for everything to fit the same way. So I'm just going to add seam allowance along the center outside split of this sleeve, just 1/2 inch seam allowance as always, or as is usual here in my sewing room. And my hair is falling apart the more and more time I spend over the drafting table today. Oh well. My hair is just long enough that I can put the top of it into a ponytail. It's very exciting for me because otherwise it just floops around and gets in the way, honestly. I will be using the slight A-line version of my skirt for this dress that I made late in the year last year for the last black dress I made. So I can link that video below. Basically, it's just the A-line skirt as I normally make it, but instead of closing both darts at the waist, I just close one dart at the waist for less flare. And then it was time to refine my designs over on the computer and cut them out of the HTV over here on the silhouette machine. And then I can go ahead and weed those. Again, this is like a silver chrome finish of HTV, heat transfer vinyl, that I can link below for you. And I designed these so that I could easily weed them, which was nice, like so. For the top portion of this garment, from like the waist up, I'm going to have 2 rectangles on the sleeves, on the back of the sleeves. I'm going to have 2 rectangles on the front, and then one split down the center back. I will have a thinner rectangle on either side of the zipper, basically, that will look equivalent to the other rectangles, even if it's a little bit different because of the center back zipper. We all know I wasn't going to move that center back zipper. It's me. But the idea here was to place these designs on my garment where the mon or the crest on a Japanese kimono would be. So if you've ever seen a formal kimono, a formal black kimono, 5 crests is the most formal for kimono, 2 on the front, 2 on the back of the sleeves, and 1 in the center back. So that's kind of The idea for the placement of this was just to follow the way that Japanese kimono are done. And I went ahead and did transfer my dart markings from my skirt pattern onto the back of the skirt here so I can sew those darts in a moment. And I also have these larger decorations, larger rectangles to put on the bottom of this skirt front as well, just to tie into everything else. The more marbled, metallic, fun stuff I can do, really the better. And I was just figuring out the placement of where I wanted everything to go using my ruler and some tailor's chalk here on the outside of this. Luckily, this tailor's chalk didn't stick too well because this fabric is a little on the spongy and a little on the fuzzy side. This is a brushed wool blend fabric from Mood Fabrics. This is actually a Donna Karan fabric, but it had, instead of having like a width-wise stretch, this has a little bit of elastic in it, and the elastin is lengthwise. The stretch is in the opposite direction that I'm used to, so it doesn't go widthwise across the fabric, it goes lengthwise, which was really annoying because I don't need more stretch vertically in my garments. I would like stretch horizontally, but I didn't want to also have to cut this out not on the straight grain or like on cross grain instead. It was very confusing, and I had thought that the tiny amount of elastin wouldn't be a problem, but the more I started working on this project, the more I realized that this was just too stretchy to fully line it like I had originally planned to. So anytime I use a wool, luckily this one isn't itchy, but normally when I use a wool, I like to fully line it just to avoid any possible itchiness against my skin. So I was planning on fully lining this with a smooth rayon lining. But because the lining has zero stretch and because this had funky vertical too much stretch, I really like the way this fabric feels. I like the way it wears. It sews pretty well. I just didn't think I could line it with something that didn't have stretch because I knew this fabric was going to stretch and move around more than the lining would, and any area where I had the lining like flat lined to the garment, it was going to stretch at a different rate than the outside fabric. So I'm just trying to explain why I didn't line this garment in the end. I was intending to. In the end, I did not. I ended up doing a facing for this. You'll see that later on. But yes, I'm still figuring out the positioning of my HTV and ironing that on. Now, with this material, as I said in the video where I did the handbag over on the channel, this material, it is recommended to press twice, once with this plastic backing, peel the backing, and then press again with just the Teflon. However, when I did a test piece with this particular fabric, which is a, again, wool blend, not what the heat transfer vinyl people are expecting you to use, when I did that second press, it really did not like it and started melting apart and was a big no. So I learned that I could only press this once, so I had to make sure I pressed it really well with the plastic backing on because I wasn't going to get another chance, which made this a little bit extra harrowing, which was nice. And in general, this silver has quite a chrome, very shiny finish, but on this particular fabric, it came out a little bit more matte than usual. And then it also did not like being heated again. So in any way, I could not reheat this. Otherwise, it would lose some more of its shine. So I was trying very hard while constructing the rest of this garment to not get steam or more heat near the heat transfer vinyl itself. And you might be thinking, well, gosh, you can't throw that in the wash. But I can't throw a wool blend dress in the wash anyway. So this would be dry clean only anyhow. So not worried about that. But I will pinch and pin my darts now that I have my HTV on the bodice pieces. I can start sewing all my darts again. 2 on the back, and then 6 darts total for the front piece here. 3 on each side, so plenty of darts to sew. As usual, I'm taking that over to the machine, starting at the large end of the dart, sewing off the tip, and then tying the threads shut, as I always do for when I'm sewing darts, because as we know, I use a lot of darts in my sewing, so you've seen me sew many a dart before. And once my darts were all sewn and pressed, I could go ahead and line up my side seams and my shoulder seams and sew those together next. Sorry if some parts of this video are a little dark. Later on, they'll be a little overexposed because I was feeling conscious of this being like a black void of a fabric. And so I turn up the exposure and you'll see it's not as pretty, but at least you can sort of tell what I'm doing as compared to here, where luckily you understand what I mean when I say I'm lining up the side seams. So you don't really need to see it with this slightly velvety textured wool, honestly. Again, it feels very nice. It's just a little bit frustrating to work with because it's got almost a bit of a scuba fabric texture. It's a bit spongy. And I'll just go ahead and sew those seams over here on the machine, of course. And you can see I haven't done anything to my edges, my raw edges, because I was still thinking I was going to fully line this. But as I was doing this, as I was working with the fabric, I was realizing this is just too stretchy for lining. Unless I had a stretchy lining. You can also find lining with a little bit of stretch in it, and that may have worked for this, but I didn't have any in stock, so I was going to have to skip the lining and go ahead and finish this with facings instead. But I will go ahead and run the raw edge of the waist and the side seams and things like that through my serger eventually, so eventually you may catch that there is serger thread along the raw edges in the future, and that's not because I had the foresight to do it beforehand. It's because I had to do it mid-sewing, which is never very fun. You could also use rayon seam binding or bind those in some other way as well, or just go ahead and do some like whip stitching or fell them down, whatever you want. But I clipped the curves over my shoulder seam, the shoulder/collar seam, and pressed that open on either side. And this is how we're looking so far. Time to start working on the skirt. I sewed the darts in the skirt, and I can go ahead and press those. And then I can line up my side seams for the skirt and sew this together as well. Again, A-line skirts always go together super easily, even if this A-line still has a few darts left. Usually A-line skirts have no darts left, but it's alright. I wanted a slightly less flared A-line for this design. And I'll go ahead and sew those side seams over here on the machine. 1/2 inch seam allowance as usual. And look at me trying to be good and remember to remove my pins today. I don't remember why I was being so conscious about it. Some days I care, some days I don't, as we know. And the other side the same way. Now I can go ahead and press open that side seam. Once again, not serged yet. Bummer. I'll have to run it through the serger even though it's already sewn together, which is just less fun. It's more fiddly for sure. I use my tailor's ham to press open the top of this, over the curve over the hip, on both sides of this, like so. Although my iron has stopped giving me as much steam lately, I don't know what its problem is. Perhaps it needs to be cleaned. It has like a self-cleaning function, so I should probably do that. So yes, I did come back over here on the patterning table, take my pattern, and trace some like 3-inch wide-ish facings up here, just to make sure I encompassed the all-in-one collar like that, and got everything cleanly finished along the neckline and along the back zipper and stuff. So traced some facings real fast, cut those out of spare fabric, and prepped those ready to go. This fabric is, again, on the spongier and kind of thicker side, so I didn't bother to interface this. Again, I was conscious that I didn't want to do anything on here that was less stretchy than the rest of the fabric because I didn't want them to stretch at different rates. So I just kept this fabric as is. Again, think of scuba fabric. It's smooth, it holds its shape, but it is spongy. Hopefully this makes any sense. Maybe I'm just weird today, or every day, honestly, as we know. But I had to clip my curves for the collar of the shoulder seam on the facing as well and press those open, so that's what I'm doing here. You can see, actually, if you look super close in the lower left-hand side of the screen, that I have serged the waist seam of that bodice at this point, so encased some of the raw edges. Now, before I sew this facing on, right sides together to the bodice itself, I wanted to go ahead and mark where exactly I needed to sew at the tip of the V. It's just really easy to get lost and have the angle be off in here, so I like to mark it with a white gel pen or colored pencil. Whatever works better on the fabric I'm working with. But I will line up the shoulder seams of the bodice and the facing, again right sides together here, so I can finish this neckline with this lovely impromptu facing that I put together. I'll just pin that all along the front neckline and the back neckline. It doesn't really matter that this has this little bit of a collar extension. It's a bit curvy, but otherwise the operation of putting the facing on is the same as it would be on any other dress. And I'll stitch that into place over here on the machine. And I will need to go ahead and clip that center V, always very nerve-wracking, I know. And I will clip my curves as they exist up here around the collar at the shoulder seam, where the shoulder seam meets a little bit. And then I will actually throw some understitching along this as well. So I'll bring this back over the machine and throw understitching in here along this, just again, because it is a little bit on the thicker and spongier side. I wanted this facing to stay rolled to the inside of the garment, so I wanted to make sure I put understitching in here. Just, again, sewing the seam allowance down. It's like underneath the short side, the facing side here, under my right hand. As I go around, here I'm turning at the point of the V, hoping for the best, and just keep stitching the other side. So yes, I'm stitching the seam allowance down to the facing underneath here. Just harder to see when I'm doing it from the outside like this. And I will give that some steam and press everything into place now that the facing is attached. I will actually end up tacking this facing along the shoulder seam here. Plenty of excess seam allowance in there to tack that down to. And then you'll see how I finish this along the zipper later as well. Although I didn't go super detailed into the zippering today. And now that my bodice is all together, I'm not going to attach the sleeves at this point. I'm actually going to attach the sleeves last because they are so gigantic that maneuvering this project around the sewing room with the sleeves attached was going to be annoying, so I actually attached the sleeves last. We'll get to that later. But for now, it was time to sew the skirt and the bodice together at the waist seam, and then I could go ahead and put in that center back zipper. So that's what I'm going to do here now. From where the zipper will end along the center back of the skirt, I will sew that shut all the way to the hem. I didn't leave a slit in this. If you needed to like run in this garment, the skirt is probably not wide enough for that because it's not the full A-line, but I don't anticipate needing to run, hopefully. So I didn't leave a slit in the back of this, but I will just otherwise fold back the 1 inch of seam allowance I leave along my center back, iron that into place, and then stitch my zipper down. Of course, I'm doing a lapped zipper as per usual. And then you can see here how I'm maneuvering that wide facing. I just have that seam allowance ironed into place, and then I'm folding that along the zipper tape on the inside and then hand stitching that into place. And I actually hand stitched this zipper in today just because this fabric, again, had that little bit of spongy stretchiness. And I was worried because the nylon zipper is very rigid and not stretchy, and the fabric is very stretchy, that things were going to get wonky over on the machine. So I just went ahead and hand stitched the zipper in. But the neckline is finished. The zipper is in. We just need these giant sleeves. So again, I was not able to cut these out in one giant piece for each sleeve. So I do have an underarm seam still to deal with. And because these sleeves will be open and are not going to be lined, this underarm seam will in some ways be visible. So if you wanted to use a French seam here, this is a good spot for that. Again, this fabric is on the thicker side. I didn't want to fuss with that. So I'm actually going to sew it normally and then fold the seam allowance in on itself. I'll show you this in a moment. And then I hand stitched that down. So this project did end up taking longer than I anticipated, just because of the amount of hand stitching I did in the end, because I was hand stitching down the seam allowance for these giant sleeves, and then I hand stitched down the hem on the giant sleeves later, so it did take a while. But with that underarm seam sewn into place there, that one that I layered shut earlier and didn't want to have, but you know, fabric is only so wide, so do what you gotta do to get things together. So I've kept my underarm seam, and now I've pressed that open and I'm folding each side in on itself. So this is 1/2 inch wide seam allowance. So I'm folding it 1/4 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch again, just in on itself to have a nice finished little edge on the inside here without having to do binding of any kind, because again, already kind of thick. We don't want to have to do that. So I'm just pinning either side of this, and I will hand stitch it down, invisibly stitching it, kind of like I would do with a hem stitch. So a tiny stitch on the outside, a longer stitch on the inside. Keeping the stitches on the inside about a centimeter inside that fold, and then a tiny little millimeter stitch on the outside. And luckily, because this fabric has a bit of a brushed finish, a velvety suede-like finish, it actually looks quite a lot like ultra suede in the end. These stitches were completely lost in this, so it was a quite invisible way to finish this off. It did just take a little bit more time, however. And here you can see what I mean about the shot being overblown. So the lighting here is not ideal for everything else, but at least you can see what's going on in this very black fabric. So forgive the overexposure. Hopefully it means you can see what's going on with the dress at least, or the sleeves here. Now that the hand finishing on the underarm seam was done, I could go ahead and sew the outside seam. On the McQueen dresses I was looking at, I think they're split entirely along the sleeve, but I like to wear undershirts underneath things that I don't want to have to dry clean all the time. So in order to be able to wear a little short-sleeved undershirt underneath this, I wanted to have the top of the sleeve closed. So I just sewed the first 6 inches or so closed, and then I will press back the rest of the seam allowance when I'm pressing that open. And again, turn that 1/4 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch and hand hem this just as I did for the underarm seam, even though this one is open as opposed to closed. So yes, a lot of hand hemming going on with these giant sleeves. Basically, I could have made 2 circle skirts in the amount of time that I made these sleeves instead. But it is worth it for a dress that in the end makes it look like I'm wearing a cape without having to have a separate cape. And what more can you ask for in winter than a high-collared, kind of commanding, black swishy cape dress? I mean, that's what we're all looking for, no? It has the same twirlability as a circle skirt, only it's circles on my arms. And as you are watching this, I actually have not sewn anything in about a week, maybe a little over a week. I haven't actually been able to get any sewing done this last week because I've been working on other stuff, and so I'm excited to get back to it. I had a nice break over the Christmas time, and I'm eager to start making some more stuff because I've got lots of ideas and never enough time, as always. And I finally put my little decals onto the sleeves as well. This is on the back of the sleeve, or the back side next to the split. Just put these last two little decals on there, and then I had to figure out how to hem these giant sleeves. And I wanted something that was very inconspicuous and blended right in. And of course it is a giant curve, so no one is surprised that I'm using bias tape to hem these. So I did cut some black silk taffeta into 2-inch wide strips along the bias and folded that into bias tape here to use to hem my sleeves. I'll go ahead and pin and stitch that down along the outside hem of my sleeves, and then turn that to the inside, press it again, and hand stitch that down. I forgot to get a clip of me turning this and ironing it and pinning it to the inside today. Don't know what was going on there. Perhaps it was late at night again. Again, I sewed this over a week ago, and now I don't remember, which just shows where my head is at, honestly. And finally, I can take the finished dress and the finished and hemmed sleeves and go ahead and attach the two together. So I'll go ahead and pin the underarm seam of the sleeve to the side seam of my dress, the split of the sleeve at the top of the sleeve cap to the shoulder seam like so, and then make everything fit in between. Again, this is where the stretchiness kind of reared its head a little bit because things were fitting together in a weird way when compared to, say, a normal woven fabric. This one just had enough sponginess that this was a little weird, but all's well that ends well, as I always say. Luckily, one benefit of this fabric being on the spongy side is that it did not want to fray very much, so I wasn't super worried about having raw edges in here. So you can see while I did serge some of this, I didn't actually serge the arm side or the sleeve cap. We'll hope for the best there, you know? All right, sleeve is on. Good. One more to go. And then I did hem the dress using the same technique as I did for hemming the sleeves. I used the black taffeta bias tape for that as well. Again, it's a subtle curve down there on the bottom of the slight A-line. And then my last step for this was actually to make some custom little shoulder pads to go in here. These are not very huge shoulder pads. They're quite subtle. I only added 1/4 inch at the shoulder anyhow, so I knew I couldn't fit a giant shoulder pad in here. I just wanted something with a little bit of structure for these giant sleeves to hang from, honestly. So I cut semicircles out of the remaining black fabric from this project, and then layered up a couple of semicircles of a thicker wool fabric from my scrap bin to go ahead and create these little shoulder pads that I could tack into the shoulder of my dress. And I do like to give those a good steam here. I just quilted them a little bit over on the machine and then ran the curved edge through my serger. And then I just pin these to my tailor's ham and give them a good steam and a good press, let them cool a little bit while they're still in this curved shape, just to give them a little bit more body, or help them fit the body a little bit more and not be so springy and flat as they are when you first create them. Let those cool a little bit. And I just tack these in along the shoulder seam so that they stick out about 1/2 inch beyond the shoulder tip. And just helped give me a tiny bit more structure out there because we all know I love a strong shoulder. I always say the stronger the shoulder, the smaller the waist looks. It's something the 1940s taught me. It's something the 1980s remembered very well, maybe too well, honestly. The size of the shoulders in the 80s. Like many things, the 1980s took something from the 40s and exaggerated it perhaps a little too far. Sometimes it works, and sometimes it's too much. And here is my finished brushed wool suiting, slightly too stretchy dress with its absolutely gargantuan sleeves. And this is another dress where I do feel quite powerful wearing it and ready to, I don't know, dominate a board meeting, even though I've never been in one. I hope you enjoyed seeing how this project from the past came together and had a nice fond time reminiscing with the blue patterning Table of Doom. Thank you again to my patrons for making this and all of my videos possible. I could not keep doing what I do without your help, so thank you. And while I may be taking a few extra days here to reset properly at the start of the new year, I will of course be back with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, crafting, and decorating real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye.